So imagine for a second that you're looking at a group of citizens, right?
Mhm.
And they decide to just, well, to simply build a fully functional, self-sufficient town.
Right in the middle of the Florida Everglades, of all places.
Exactly. I mean, we were talking about people who are growing their own food, minting their own silver currency, and just operating entirely unplugged from modern society.
Really off the grid.
Yeah. Now, imagine the massive, just unprecedented, and ultimately violent jurisdictional war that this quiet little town triggers. And the fight isn't just with them. It's between the governor of Florida and the federal government.
It's a crazy scenario, honestly. But it forces us to look at, the absolute limits of autonomy.
Right.
Because when a group of people quietly proves they just don't need the system, they instantly become the system's most dangerous problem.
Oh, absolutely. So, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are opening up a really fascinating piece of source material. It's an investigative fictional account, and it's titled Sanaurelio.pdf.
Yeah, and it chronicles the rise and then the incredibly destructive fall of a libertarian community called San Aurelio.
Which acts as this perfect lens, right? Through this story, we're going to examine the actual mechanics of power, institutional authority, and just that inherent grinding tension between state and federal governments in the U.S.
Exactly. The author uses this fictional case study to basically build a laboratory for examining power.
Yeah, drawing heavily on real history.
Right, but without getting us instantly bogged down in our own, real-world partisan defense mechanisms.
Which is so refreshing. And that is exactly our mission today. We are going to dive deep into the mechanics of the political clash at the heart of this text.
Putting the microscope on two very specific entities.
Yes. On one side, we have the protective, states' rights posture of the
Yep.
governor of Florida. And on the other side, the containment-focused, highly paranoid position of the federal government.
We're going to decode the true motives driving both those sides.
Right. And it's really important to note right up front for you listening as we dive into these highly charged political themes.
Because there's a lot of them. Libertarianism, government overreach.
Taxation, federal law enforcement tactics, yeah. Our goal today is absolutely not to take a side. We aren't endorsing any political viewpoints, left, right, fringe, whatever.
No, we are strictly acting as impartial guides through this fictional source text.
Just breaking down the architecture of the conflict exactly as it's presented to us.
Analyzing the mechanics of the story, looking at how the tension is built and exploited by everyone involved.
Right. So let's just set the stage. Before San Aurelio became a political football or, a talking point on national cable news, it was literally just a ghost town.
An old Spanish settlement turned sugar town.
Yeah, that got completely swallowed up by the Everglades when the local mill closed down decades ago. Just decades of overgrowth, roofless buildings, collapsed water towers,
A total blank slate.
or, I guess, more accurately, a forgotten slate.
Right, and that forgotten nature is exactly what gave them the legal and physical camouflage to move in.
Which brings us to the founders. The document introduces us to this core group who met at a cinder block dive bar on Highway 27 called Red Dogs.
And understanding these four individuals is absolutely key to understanding why the government reacted the way it did later.
Yeah, we have to start with Sarah Whitfield. She's described as basically having the initial seed of the whole idea. She was this off-grid farmer in Virginia, sold raw milk, grew her own vegetables, just minding her own business.
Until state inspectors bulldozed her greenhouses over some incredibly complex environmental regulations.
Right, so Sarah kind of represents the foundational grievance of San Aurelio.
She did. She realized that trying to survive inside the system was just a losing game because the rules are, constantly shifting to ensure compliance.
And extract revenue.
Exactly. And to protect massive corporate agriculture interests. It's not just that she wanted to farm. She realized the barrier to entry for independence was deliberately set impossibly high.
By regulatory capture.
Right. She didn't want to fight the state. She just wanted to exist outside of its reach.
Which makes sense.
Hmm.
Then you have Marcus Lee. He's this young tech kid, a self-taught encryption expert, a programmer who used to run blogs against what he called digital landlords.
He brings the structural, modern mindset. Marcus is the 21st century edge of this whole frontier movement.
Because independence isn't just about growing your own tomatoes anymore, right?
Oh, not at all. It's about securing your communications, untangling yourself from the digital financial grid.
Yeah. The text notes he recognized that if you use standard banking or standard internet providers,
Or standard cell networks, yeah. You are entirely visible and completely vulnerable to pressure. You can be deplatformed or debanked at a moment's notice.
So he brings the architecture of invisibility.
Exactly.
Then there's Gabriel Martinez, they call him Gabo, Cuban immigrant who fled communism. He used to work in the resort strip of Veradero.
Watching party elites drink imported champagne while regular people stood in bread lines.
Yeah, that visual is striking. So he brings this intense moral clarity. He firmly believes you don't need to hide if you've done nothing wrong.
Gabo is the philosophical anchor. I mean, he's seen the absolute extreme end of state control.
When the others talk about government overreach as like a nuisance or a theory.
Gabo knows it as a crushing, lived reality.
Yeah.
He understands how a state justifies suffocating its citizens for, quote, the greater good.
That gives the movement a lot of gravity.
Yeah, it grounds their libertarian ideals in very visceral historical trauma.
Right. And finally, Ethan Brooks. 18 years in the Army infantry. Came home from his tours, looked at the system he'd spent his life defending, and just felt totally alienated.
And when he meets this group, he realizes they need something only he has. Because they're idealists, and idealists need someone to watch their backs.
Ethan is the pragmatist.
For sure, a fortress starts as a crazy idea, but it only survives if it can be physically defended.
He knows how to set up perimeters, organize logistics, maintain discipline.
He's not looking for a fight. But he knows history is exceedingly unkind to defenseless utopias.
Oh, that's a great way to put it. Now, they don't just go out and squat in the swamp, though. This is so interesting. They use a legal mechanism to start the town. Sarah researches the doctrine of adverse possession.
This is such a crucial detail. It shows they were actively trying to engage with the system's own rules to achieve their exit.
Right. Adverse possession is this old piece of common law, basically, and it varies by state. But if someone abandons a piece of property and you move on to it, occupy it openly and notoriously.
Maintain it, improve it, and critically pay the property taxes on it for a set number of years.
You can actually claim legal title to the land.
Yeah, but open and notorious is the key phrase there, meaning they aren't hiding.
Right. You can't just pitch a camouflage tent in the woods and claim the land a decade later.
No, you have to act like the owner. Build fences, clear brush, fix structures, and they did. They were attempting to carve out their sanctuary using the system's own forgotten loopholes.
They filed the paperwork. They paid the back taxes. They were daring the county to stop them.
Banking on the fact that no one cared about a ruined sugar town in the middle of a swamp.
Exactly. And so they build an economy. And this is where the tension really starts to build. They salvage old hand-crank water pumps, fix up the buildings, start trading goods and services, honey, mechanical work, carpentry.
But they don't use the US dollar.
Right. They start using silver coins for currency, completely bypassing the Federal Reserve.
Which is the pivot point. That is where they transition from being a quirky commune to an existential threat.
Setting up a local barter system is one thing, right? Like, you fix my roof, I give you a side of beef.
The IRS hates it, but it's hard to scale.
Yeah.
But standardizing trade on precious metals, that changes everything.
But wait, how does that actually work in practice? If you want to buy a dozen eggs, you can't hand over a 1-ounce silver coin. That coin is worth way more than the eggs.
Exactly, which is why the mechanics of their economy are so fascinating. The text says they used fractional silver, so small dimes and quarters minted before 1965.
Oh, because those were made of 90% silver.
Right, commonly called junk silver. They priced local goods based on the actual weight of the silver, completely detached from the fiat spot price of the US dollar.
Wow. And Marcus Lee even developed a localized, encrypted digital ledger for larger transactions.
Backed by physical silver held in a community vault, so you could transfer fractions of an ounce digitally to your neighbor to pay for a plumbing repair.
So they created a parallel financial ecosystem, and the locals from nearby towns actually interacted with them.
Oh yeah, people outside San Aurelio saw polite, hardworking folks paying for hardware and supplies in cash or silver.
They were peaceful.
Very peaceful, but their underlying crime wasn't violence, it was independence.
Yeah.
They stopped relying on the system, they stopped asking for permission, they stopped needing the state's money, its food supply, its approval.
In the eyes of a highly centralized bureaucratic apparatus, true independence is just indistinguishable from defiance. Okay, let's unpack this for a second. It's like they were playing a massive multiplayer online game, right? And instead of fighting the boss monster or hang out in the forums complaining about the server rules, they just logged off and built their own private server.
That is a perfect analogy. They wrote their own code.
And just like a game developer, the federal government doesn't care if a few frustrated players quit.
But if those players build a better competing platform next door, that is a direct threat to the developer's entire business model.
Yeah.
If Cinerilio proves that you can live comfortably and prosperously without the US dollar, without the Federal Reserve, and without federal oversight.
The illusion of inevitability that props up the state just begins to crack.
Exactly. But this absolute detachment from the grid created a fatal byproduct, which was visibility.
And that visibility triggered major alarm bells in Washington. This brings us to the massive trove of FOIA requests the author details in the document.
Decades after the events, yeah.
Right. Internal memos from the IRS, the ATF, Homeland Security, the DOJ, and they paint a wild picture of the paranoia taking root in D.C.
It really is a masterclass in bureaucratic self-preservation. When you read the rhetoric of these federal agencies, you realize they are not looking at a small town of farmers and coders.
They are looking at a systemic leak. The DOJ calls them a, quote, troubling precedent and a proto-separatist cell.
And the Treasury Department is having absolute fits over economic contagion. They use the phrase, the precedent danger of non-dollarized internal transactions.
They are terrified of the silver economy.
They should be. From a federal perspective, the monopoly on currency is the absolute bedrock of state power.
Right, fiat currency, money that has value just because the government says it does.
And it relies entirely on the government's ability to demand that taxes be paid in that currency. If citizens can trade value, build wealth, and sustain communities without using the U.S. dollar.
The federal government loses its ability to tax.
To inflate the currency, to pay off national debt, and to track economic activity.
There's actually a Treasury memo that explicitly mentions silver arbitrage.
Right, because they aren't worried about the lost tax revenue from a few dozen people in a swamp. That's pennies.
They are terrified of the model spreading.
Exactly. If San Aurelio functions as a proof of concept for a localized sound money economy, thousands of other disenfranchised communities across the country might try the same thing.
And the monopoly shatters. They use the phrase economic contagion, literally like it's a virus.
And how do you treat a contagion? You isolate it and you eradicate it. The federal motive here is pure control and compliance.
The text notes explicitly that internally, the agencies weren't actually terrified of San Aurelio's physical weapons.
Even though they heavily emphasize them on television later.
Right. They were terrified of their success. One leaked DOJ memo states, not only do we solve this problem, but we inoculate the population against trying it again.
Inoculate the population.
That phrasing is chilling. It implies that San Aurelio is the disease and a violent raid is the vaccine.
Notice the underlying assumption in that memo, too. The population is susceptible to this disease.
Yeah, Washington knows that millions of Americans are frustrated, overtaxed, distrustful of institutions.
The DOJ knows the tinder is dry. The memo continues. If they succeed, even for 5 years, we'll have 10 more San Aurelios spring up like mushrooms. The precedent is the threat, not their guns or their gardens.
But Washington has this massive problem. The optics. They are terrified of repeating the catastrophic mistakes of the 1990s.
We see memos explicitly stating, Waco 2.0 must be avoided, but optics. Ruby Ridge in the sun must be avoided too.
They know they need to crush the settlement, but they can't afford to create martyrs.
Those historical specters haunt the entire federal strategy in this text. At Ruby Ridge, you had the FBI and U.S. Marshals killing a mother holding a baby over a minor firearms charge.
And at Waco, the ATF and FBI besieged a religious compound, resulting in a fire that killed over 70 people.
Children included. In both cases, the extreme violence of the federal response catalyzed massive anti-government blowback.
So the agencies in this story know that burning down a compound of off-grid farmers is going to look like tyranny.
A CIA intelligence memo actually advising the DOJ suggests avoiding a frontal confrontation because the martyrdom risk outweighs operational benefit.
So what does this all mean? What do they do? The CIA memo suggests a strategy of economic strangulation plus reputational attrition.
They want to discredit the model before it can replicate. Reputational attrition means a highly coordinated smear campaign.
If you can convince the American public that these aren't peaceful homesteaders, but rather dangerous, unhinged extremists,
then the public will cheer when you finally send in the armored vehicles.
There's one internal DOJ email that is just breathtaking in its cynicism. Let me read this. He says, "We don't need another Waco. We need another Jonestown, where they drink their own poison and the public blames them."
It exposes the absolute moral void at the center of the bureaucratic response.
Yeah.
They don't care about the truth of what's happening in San Aurelio.
Not at all.
They care about crafting a narrative where the destruction of the community appears to be the community's own fault.
The legal infractions, right, like building code violations, using alternative currency, buying bulk ammunition for hunting.
Those were merely the pretext. The real goal was narrative control.
And they weaponize the media masterfully. Rumors start flying that San Aurelio is sitting on a massive underground vault of gold.
Which is completely fabricated.
Completely. Local officials whisper it, then local TV repeats it, and suddenly cable news anchors are talking about the Florida gold cult.
And the gold cult narrative is a perfect device because it completely shifts the public perception of the founders.
They go from being sympathetic, hardworking people trying to live a simple life to greedy, secretive hoarders sitting on a dragon's hoard of wealth.
More importantly, it justifies federal intervention. You don't send tactical teams to audit a tomato farmer.
But you absolutely send them to secure an illegal, heavily armed gold vault.
The narrative detaches entirely from reality, driven by strategic, anonymous leaks from ambitious bureaucrats in D.C.
Okay, so just as the federal agencies are closing their grip, just as they're winning this PR war and preparing to move in and strangle San Aurelio economically,
Right.
a massive political roadblock appears right in their path. And it doesn't come from the founders. It comes from the state capital in Tallahassee.
Enter the governor of Florida.
Yes.
Yeah.
This is where the story shifts from a tragedy of idealists to a high-stakes constitutional thriller. The federal agencies are tightening the noose. They're cutting off FedEx deliveries, flying drones overhead, monitoring cell traffic around the swamp.
And then the governor of Florida steps up to the microphone, flanked by state flags.
And he delivers a masterstroke of political theater. He declares, "The people of San Aurelio are Floridians. They are under Florida law. The federal government has no business interfering in how we Floridians live, work, or worship." Washington would do well to remember that this is still a republic of states.
This is textbook, classical states' rights rhetoric, tapping into a very deep, very old vein of American political sentiment.
A tension between the federal government and state sovereignty.
Exactly, which is baked right into the DNA of the Constitution. Specifically, the governor is weaponizing the 10th Amendment.
The one that reserves powers not delegated to the federal government to the states or the people.
Right, weaponizing that against the Federal Supremacy Clause.
But let's look at his actual motives here, because this is the core of the conflict. Is he doing this because he suddenly loves San Aurelio? Does the governor of Florida genuinely believe in a silver-backed economy and off-grid, unregulated living?
Almost certainly not. Think about the mechanics of being a state governor.
Yeah.
You rely on state property taxes, state sales taxes, and state regulatory compliance, just as much as the federal government relies on income tax.
Right. The governor has no ideological desire to see Florida carved up into sovereign, untaxable microstates.
So why step in front of the federal bulldozer?
Why do it?
Because San Aurelio has suddenly become the perfect, highly visible opportunity to assert state sovereignty against federal overreach for his own political gain.
By claiming jurisdiction over San Aurelio, the governor is attempting to shield them, but he's doing it because it serves his immediate narrative needs.
The document reveals that the governor's campaign strategists privately loved the situation. San Aurelio became a prop for speeches.
The governor gets to play the heroic, square-jawed defender of local liberty against the evil, faceless, overreaching bureaucrats in Washington.
And it works brilliantly. The document notes that his defiance drove the White House absolutely crazy.
One White House aide writes, "The governor is sheltering extremists. This cannot stand."
The calculation is fascinating here. The governor isn't passing laws to make silver legal tender in Florida. He isn't abolishing state property taxes or endorsing Gabo and Marcus's philosophy.
He is simply using their geographical location to draw a jurisdictional line in the sand. He is saying, I don't care what they're doing, I care who gets to police them. Here's where it gets really interesting. Governor essentially turned San Aurelio into a political human shield. He didn't say, these guys are right about the Federal Reserve. He just said, they are mine, back off.
It's essentially a massive custody battle.
It's exactly like two divorced parents fighting over a kid in a vicious court battle. Neither parent actually wants to raise the kid. They just want to win the argument, inflict pain on the ex, and look like the victor to the judge.
That dynamic is exactly right. Tallahassee sees San Aurelio as a wedge issue to rally a political base, fundraise, and score massive points against D.C. on a national stage.
And Washington sees San Aurelio as a threat to systemic compliance that must be crushed.
But D.C. is stymied because the governor has elevated a local zoning and tax dispute into a full-blown constitutional standoff.
And caught in the middle of this massive clash of titans are the actual living residents of San Aurelio, who just want to be left alone to tend their bees and write their code.
It's terrifying when you realize that to the governor, San Aurelio is just a talking point, and to the feds, it's just a contagion.
Nobody in power sees them as humans anymore.
Marcus Lee types in a private encrypted chat that gets leaked later. He says, IRS sees criminals, ATF sees militias, media sees cultists. Nobody sees humans.
That is heartbreaking.
That dehumanization is a necessary prerequisite for state violence. When the state and federal governments engage in a proxy war over narrative and jurisdiction, the actual truth on the ground becomes entirely irrelevant.
The people in the swamp are just avatars for abstract political concepts.
Exactly.
And that brings us to the tipping point, the escalation. The tension is incredibly high, but it's still mostly just words, memos, and press conferences.
Until a rumor catches fire.
There's this incident with a delivery driver hauling hardware goods. He gets spooked on a back dirt road near San Aurelio. Two unidentified men step into the road.
The driver claims they were armed. He panics, throws his truck into a verse, turns around, and speeds off.
No shots are fired. No one is injured. Local sheriff's deputies investigate and write it off as a nervous driver. They're uncertain if the men were even related to San Aurelio or just local hunters.
In any normal context, it's a total non-story, a misunderstanding on a dirt road. But in an atmosphere charged with this much institutional paranoia, a non-story is all it takes to ignite the powder keg.
Yet an ambitious mid-level Justice Department official gets a hold of the local incident report, and in the margin, he scrawls in thick pen, "This is the pretext we need. Escalate."
That single handwritten note exposes the sheer opportunism of the federal apparatus. They weren't reacting to a genuine public safety threat.
They were waiting for an excuse to execute the operation they had already decided on.
Within weeks, the whisper of a spook trucker mutates. It turns into wall-to-wall national coverage of a paramilitary ambush by San Aurelio.
Mainstream outlets run stock footage of armed men in camo, and the author actually notes the footage wasn't even shot in Florida.
Of course not.
With Tyrons screaming, tax-dodging sect accused of blocking interstate commerce.
Notice how the narrative is specifically mutated to fit the necessary legal framework for federal intervention.
Blocking interstate commerce.
Right. It isn't just a scary phrase, it's a jurisdictional skeleton key. Under the Commerce Clause of the Constitution, the federal government has broad authority to regulate and protect interstate trade.
Oh, wow. So by claiming San Aurelio attacked a commercial delivery truck, the DOJ manufactures the legal hook they need to completely bypass the local Florida sheriff.
And send in federal agents.
Unbelievable. So how do the two political heavyweights react to this escalation? The governor of Florida holds another press conference.
Maintaining his calm, statesman-like demeanor.
He insists on innocent until proven guilty. He points out that local Florida authorities are already investigating the trucker incident and have found no evidence of a crime. He firmly reminds D.C. that this is still a local affair.
The governor is trying to hold the line. He's playing the voice of constitutional reason, portraying Washington as hysterical and overbearing.
But Washington is done playing games.
A DOJ margin note on the transcript of the governor's speech reads, "Governor openly defying federal jurisdiction cannot let this precedent stand."
To Washington, the governor's defense due process is indistinguishable from aiding and abetting an armed rebellion.
And the citizens of San Aurelio are completely drowned out by the noise. You have senators on the campaign trail calling it sedition in slow motion.
Talking heads on primetime cable saying this is a shadow economy running on pirate money.
Meanwhile, the document points out a stark contrast. If you look at the local Florida papers from the time, the people in the hardware stores and the diners in the nearby towns are shrugging.
They see San Aurelio as harmless. A waitress in a nearby town says, "I didn't see rebels. I saw neighbors trying to live different."
The cognitive dissonance is staggering. The closer you are to San Aurelio geographically, the more human and mundane they appear.
And the further away you get, up into the stratosphere of federal politics, think tanks, and national media, the more they become terrifying monsters intent on destroying the American way of life. I mean, think about it. When the media narrative completely detaches from reality, how can a small group of people possibly defend themselves against the entire federal apparatus?
They couldn't. They were completely outmatched in narrative power. The federal government realized they couldn't win the PR war as long as the governor of Florida was using San Aurelio to block them politically.
So they needed to force the issue.
They needed to create a reality on the ground that the governor could no longer defend. They had to shift from memos to tactical gear.
Which leads us to the climax of the document. The raid. It is harrowing, and it's heavily shrouded in the fog of war.
A local farmer's daughter actually testifies that federal agents were asking around town, and her father rode out to San Aurelio to warn them the night before.
By the time the ATF convoy leaves the paved roads and circles the dirt trails near the settlement, the tension is at an absolute boiling point.
The ATF later claims they were operating under the guise of investigating military-grade firearms. An inquiry based on those vastly exaggerated rumors of the gold vault and the cartel-level arsenal.
They claim it was supposed to be a routine compliance check.
But you don't send a tactical convoy of armored vehicles for a routine check, especially not to a community you've spent the last 6 months publicly labeling as a proto-separatist militia.
The agents are on edge. A declassified memo told them they were dealing with an incompatible society.
And the residents of San Aurelio are terrified, having watched the national media brand them as terrorists for months.
They meet on a dirt road at the perimeter of the town. An ATF agent demands to search the premises for war-grade weapons.
Ethan Brooks, the Army veteran who handles security for San Aurelio, steps forward. He tells them they are a long way from home and they won't find trouble unless they bring it.
It is the classic unstoppable force meeting the immovable object, and in that highly pressurized, deeply paranoid environment, a spark is virtually inevitable.
And a shot is fired.
The subsequent commission report and independent researchers largely agree that the shot likely came from inside San Aurelio. Not out of malice or desire to start a war, but out of fear, poor trigger discipline by a nervous resident, or just sheer panic.
But in the end, it doesn't matter who fired first.
An internal ATF memo immediately goes out over the radio. Patrol investigating suspected illegal arms stockpile at San Aurelio under fire. Multiple armed assailants. Request immediate reinforcements.
That phrasing "under fire" is all the bureaucracy needs. It flips the switch, the machine engages.
The media swarms. Satellite trucks, helicopters, floodlights. It becomes a 24-hour national spectacle, and it ends in a devastating confrontation. Fire, smoke, and death.
The post office burns to the ground. Dozens are killed, including Gabo and Sarah. San Aurelio is wiped completely off the map.
And the moment the smoke begins to clear, before the fires are even fully extinguished, the immediate political fallout begins.
The bodies aren't even cold before both the governor and the federal agencies rush to the podiums to spin the tragedy to their ultimate advantage.
The federal agencies, the ATF, IRS, FBI, flood the zone with press conferences. They use the language of justice served, domestic extremism, and credible reports of stockpiled illegal weaponry.
They frame the raid as a tragic but absolutely necessary operation to stop a dangerous, violent cult from threatening the surrounding towns.
They are executing the final phase of their strategy.
They destroyed the physical contagion. Now they must cement the ideological narrative to ensure the idea itself doesn't spread. They have to control the history of what just happened.
But the governor's spin. This is what is truly breathtaking to read. The governor of Florida steps up to the columns of the state capitol. He looks solemn. He offers his deep condolences to the families.
But he doesn't blame San Aurelio.
No, he doesn't say, "We had a dangerous cult problem and the feds helped us out." He says this is a profound tragedy brought to Florida soil, quote, "by decisions made far away, without regard for the lives of Floridians."
He talks about the heavy, tyrannical hand of federal intervention.
He uses the actual ashes of San Aurelio to deliver a final, devastating political critique of Washington, D.C.
It is a masterclass in political judo. The governor carefully distances himself from the extreme elements of San Aurelio's ideology. He doesn't defend the silver economy or the lack of building permits.
But he absolutely weaponizes their physical destruction to further his own national narrative of state sovereignty versus federal tyranny. But wait. If the governor was so fiercely protective of state sovereignty, and if he truly believed they were innocent Floridians, where was he during the raid?
Right.
He spoke after the fire. He didn't send the Florida Highway Patrol or the National Guard to block the ATF convoy. Did his earlier fiery rhetoric just agitate the feds into striking harder and faster, knowing they had to crush the settlement before the state could formally intervene?
You've hit on the dark, unspoken heart of the governor's entire strategy. By turning San Aurelio into a highly visible symbol of state defiance, he essentially painted a massive glowing target on their backs.
Wow.
He raised the stakes for Washington. The feds couldn't afford to back down and look weak against a rebellious state governor, so they escalated their timeline.
The governor provided a rhetorical shield, but when the federal bullets actually started flying, that shield vanished entirely.
He allowed them to become martyrs for his cause. A living San Aurelio was a headache for him. A dead San Aurelio was a permanent political asset.
Which brings us to the final grim chapter, the commission. After a disaster like this, Washington always does the exact same thing. They form a committee, the Special Commission on the San Aurelio Incident.
The bureaucratic whitewash.
Exactly. They hold months of televised hearings. They interview federal officers. They bring in surviving San Aurelians in shackles. They generate thousands of pages of reports. And their final conclusion:
No deliberate wrongdoing by federal agencies.
they blame miscommunication, operational inexperience, and the hostile posture of the residents. They paint the destruction of an entire community as a regrettable accident of governance.
The commission's real purpose wasn't to find the truth or establish accountability. It was to manage the optics, calm the public, and legally absolve the institutions involved.
But the true brutality of the federal response didn't happen in those sanitized commission hearings. It happened in the federal courtrooms.
The trials. They hit the survivors with everything they have. And they use a devastating legal tool, the felony murder rule.
The mechanics of how they applied this rule are vital to understanding the federal motive. Generally, the felony murder rule states that if someone dies in the course of a dangerous felony, say you and a partner rob a bank and your partner shoots a guard, you're also guilty of murder.
Even if you were just the getaway driver. The death happened during the commission of your shared felony.
But how do they apply that to San Aurelio? They weren't robbing a bank.
The federal prosecutors argued that the very existence of San Aurelio, specifically its armed perimeter and its refusal to comply with federal subpoenas, constituted a massive ongoing conspiracy to assault and obstruct federal officers.
Therefore, when an ATF agent died in the chaotic raid, everyone involved in the leadership or infrastructure of San Aurelio was legally culpable for that death as part of the overarching conspiracy. It's a breathtakingly broad and aggressive application of the law. They use it to sentence Ethan Brooks, the Army veteran, whose only crime was stepping into the road to ask for a warrant, to 40 years in federal prison without parole.
Even worse, they give Marcus Lee 10 years.
Marcus Lee, the programmer, a man who was likely sitting in a server room a mile away from the gunfire.
Exactly. The prosecution called him a dangerous ideologue wrapped in code. They argued his encrypted ledger facilitated the conspiracy that led to the violence.
D.C. uses the courtroom to send a chilling, unmistakable message to the entire country. If you resist the system, if you try to unplug, and especially if you embarrass the federal government, you will be utterly crushed.
They didn't just burn the physical buildings, they buried the survivors alive in the legal system. As that DOJ memo prophesied, they successfully inoculated the population.
They won the physical battle, decisively. They won the legal battle, ruthlessly. But if we extrapolate to the ultimate legacy of this conflict, the text suggests they lost the cultural war.
The government's actions were so heavy-handed, and the optics of the trials so blatantly vindictive, that they inadvertently achieved exactly what that CIA memo feared: martyrdom.
San Aurelio passes from geography into imagination. It becomes folklore. Libertarians and states' rights advocates hold it up as ultimate proof that peaceful self-sufficiency terrifies the state. Activists wear shirts that say, "Remember San Aurelio." It becomes a permanent rallying cry against federal overreach.
It's the ultimate irony. By trying to destroy the idea of San Aurelio, they immortalized it.
Yeah, they really did.
So, to summarize the motives we've uncovered today in this deep dive, Washington, D.C. acted out of a profound institutional terror. A terror of losing systemic control, a fear of alternative economies, and a dread of mass noncompliance. Their motive was self-preservation at all costs. And the Florida governor acted out of calculated political opportunism. He saw a chance to assert state sovereignty, to rally a base, and to elevate his own national profile by picking a fight with Washington, using the people of San Aurelio as his pawns.
Both sides operated with a cold, relentless logic. And both sides treated the actual living people of San Aurelio as completely expendable to their broader goals.
We've watched how a quiet, off-grid experiment in an overgrown Florida swamp became the flashpoint for a massive constitutional crisis.
We've seen how the grinding gears of federal anxiety collided with the cynical posturing of state-level politics, and how the idealism of building a new life was crushed to ash between those two unstoppable forces.
I want to leave you with a final, lingering question to mull over, something that isn't explicitly written in the memos, but hums just beneath the surface of this entire story.
What's that?
We've talked extensively about how the federal government and the governor of Florida fought over San Aurelio. But look closely at the aftermath. In the end, D.C. got exactly what it wanted, a definitive, terrifying precedent that crushed the idea of parallel economies, effectively inoculating the population against trying it again.
I'm the governor of Florida.
He got a permanent, tragic talking point about federal overreach, a blood-soaked banner of state sovereignty that he could campaign on for years without ever having to actually govern a rebellious town.
So in the cold, ruthless calculus of politics, both the state and the federal governments actually got exactly what they wanted out of San Aurelio's destruction.
Exactly. Which leaves us with this thought. What happens to a society when the idea of a place becomes more politically valuable to its leaders than the living, breathing people inside it?
That is heavy. Keep looking beneath the headlines, keep questioning the official narratives, and keep asking the hard questions about the true nature of power. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time.